If you want to win your fantasy football league, you obviously need to target great players. But it's just as important you know who to avoid in drafts. So here are the worst picks in every single round of your fantasy draft. Now, it shouldn't be a shocker to you that everybody in round one is a good player, and for the most part, there's no worst pick here. But if we're talking relatively, I would say that I'm most worried about Bijan Robinson as the 8th overall pick if I had to choose. But honestly, I think he's going to see 300 plus touches. I think he's going to be fine. There's really no worst first round picks. Let's just move right to round two. And this is where things start to get fun. Because in round two is the 14th overall player. Yeah, I think the worst pick in this round is Patrick Mahomes. And before everybody jumps up and down and goes crazy about the Super Bowl champion, let me explain. I fully believe that Patrick Mahomes was fantastic last year. He's always been fantastic when healthy. He was the second quarterback in points per game for fantasy, as you can see right here, over 25 per game. He led the NFL in passing yards, was second in efficiency, and added 21 rushing yards per game. Not to mention, he did all this while starting the season off with a high ankle sprain in the preseason. So there's nothing bad that you or I can say about Patrick Mahomes in real life, nor should we, but when it comes to fantasy, it is a whole different game when you factor in what a player costs you and when they are costing you that your opportunity cost. Because right now in my quarterback rankings this year, I have Mahomes as my quarterback 3. He's still in tier 1, but he's behind Josh Allen and Jalin Hurts, who I believe just have more mobile upside their fantasy cheat code. For Hurts, it's simple. He was just a deadly weapon last year, leading all quarterbacks by far with 43 red zone carries. That was top 5 in the NFL. And then, 13 rushing touchdowns, over 50 rushing yards per game. And Josh Allen, if you look at over the last 3 years, since the start of 2020, he actually has the most fantasy points of any quarterback. And last year, he finished as the QB3 despite playing his final 8 games with a torn elbow. But despite Hurts being the quarterback 1 last year, Allen being so productive since 2020, they go around after Mahomes. And it has to do with the fact that Mahomes has the bigger brand. He just had a Netflix documentary. He's coming off of a Super Bowl win. And now here's the big kicker. It's about opportunity cost. So instead of taking Mahomes in round 2, you can get maybe a Devontae Adams, a Derrick Henry, and then a Jalen Hurts in round 3, which in my opinion is a better combination than, say, a Patrick Mahomes and a T. Higgins. All right, so we survived the Patrick Mahomes worst pick in round 2. Now we go to round 3, where it's the Jacksonville Jaguars running back Travis Etienne. Look, I'm just not high on this guy. Because last year, despite seeing over 250 touches as a rookie, and he was projected to be this highly efficient player, well, he only finished with 12 fantasy points per game, 23rd amongst RBs. He was an average rusher, and Jacksonville didn't trust him in the receiving game. He was 31st in running back target shares and 27th in his route participation amongst all backs. The translation there is they just didn't let him run routes, and when he did run routes, they didn't target him. And now last year, he was often taken off the field on third downs for Jamichael Hasty of all people, and as you can see from Dwayne McFarland's tweet here, in the preseason game, yet again, on the only third down with the first team offense, he came off the field and Jamichael Hasty went in. And now Etienne also struggled in the red zone, because despite seeing a really good red zone role, 45 red zone touches last year, was 9th best in the NFL, well, he had the 2nd lowest conversion rate on these red zone touches to touchdowns. And because of his inefficiency in the red zone, the Jacksonville Jaguars in the 3rd round of the draft went ahead and grabbed Tank Bigsby, who was a good red zone producer in college and an elite pass catcher. And if we go back to the same tweet about the preseason first team offense from the Jaguars, if you look at this, Travis Etienne actually came off the field for Tank Bigsby on a short yardage situation, which means if he's going to leave the field for the first team offense for short yardage situations, he might lose red zone work as well to the rookie Bigsby. All right, so now we get to round 4, and the player who is the worst pick in round 4 of fantasy drafts is pretty simple. This one's really easy. It's Dameon Pierce from the Houston Texans. And there's 2 reasons why I'm not a big fan of Pierce. First off, last year's concerns look like they're going to continue, and number 2 is the opportunity cost of taking him in round 4. And we could begin with last year's concerns. Look, he had a nice year. He ended up going between his rushing and receiving yards over 1,100 total yards. He had 5 touchdowns, and he was able to create yards on his own because, like he was known for in college, his number 1 skill was actually being able to break tackles. He was 15th in yards created last year. And the thought process now is that they have a first-round rookie in CJ Stroud. John Mechie returns. They got Robert Woods. They got Dalton Schultz. The offense should be better. But here's the issues. Like I said, the issues from last year are going to continue. PFF has this offensive line unit rated to be the 25th in the league. They were bottom 10 last year. They look like they're going to be borderline bottom 5 this year. And Pierce was a bad receiver last year. Will that change? He was 26th in running back receiving efficiency and 32nd in receiving usage. Now, that's alarming that he's a poor receiver, because this offseason, the Texans signed the veteran Devin Singletary, who's averaged over 1,000 yards every single year of his career, and he's a much better pass catcher efficiency-wise than Pierce. And here's the deal. Pierce was the 20th best fantasy running back last year, despite having the 6th most opportunities of any running back in the league. His opportunity share nearly 74%, and with Singletary there, you could expect this now to drop this year. And now remember earlier on I said the other reason I don't like Pierce is because of the opportunity cost. Why would you take him in round 4 when in like round 5 and 6 you have guys like J.K. Dobbin, James Conner, Cam Akers? You can keep scrolling down to borderline round 7 where Alvin Kamara is, Rashaad White, David Montgomery entering round 8. These are guys I just rather have than a 4th round Pierce. So now let's get into round 5. And if you're finding this content helpful, make sure you hit the subscribe button because it helps me, but it also helps you get all the content you need to smack around your buddies this year. Now we're entering round 5, and there's a lot of interesting names on the screen right now. Which one is it going to be? There's some quarterbacks here. There's some running backs. I mean, right now, Miles Sanders dealing with a groin injury. It is not him, though. It is the tight end on the screen in round 5, George Kittle. All right, so let me make my case for why the number 2 tight end last year with 13.4 points per game is actually the worst pick in round 5 this year. In 2022, Kittle actually remained healthy, playing his most games since 2018, and he ended up being the second most efficient tight end because of this. So all that's great news. So why is he a bad option in fantasy this year? Well, this right here. Last year, he played 4 games without Deebo Samuel and scored 20 fantasy points. In the 11 games with Deebo Samuel, just 11. So he scored last year 81% more points when Deebo was out. And when Deebo was active, George Kittle ran less routes. He was blocking more because he's an elite blocker, which actually harms his fantasy value. You run less routes, you see less targets. And now this year, Deebo Samuel is healthy for the first time in training camp in 3 years. And now it's also worth noting that Kittle's going to have to compete with Christian McCaffrey, not just for half the year because McCaffrey was traded from the Panthers last year, but the entire year. So it's McCaffrey, it's Deebo, and yeah, it's Brandon Ayuk too. So that's the guy I don't want in round 5. Now let's move to round 6. We're starting to get to the middle rounds where you can really find league winners. And you can also find guys here who will tank your roster. So the worst pick in round 6, a running back out of Kansas City, Isiah Pacheco. As of this recording, Pacheco is still not participating in contact drills during camp, and we're only a few weeks away from the season. And if you're not caught up to speed, he had a shoulder separation of his labrum last October. He had surgery during the offseason after the Super Bowl, and he ended up having the surgery in like March, and he's still not ready to take contact. Now, he's come out and said that he could play tomorrow if there was a game, but he hasn't played in the preseason. He hasn't taken any contact reps, so there's a little bit of a concern here. So let's dive a little deeper here because Pacheco as a 7th round rookie was great last year, but now the expectations change as a 6th round fantasy pick. He only had 14 targets. He saw the 2nd worst usage as a receiving running back last year of any back. And there's 2 reasons for this. The first is that Jerick McKinnon, a teammate of his, is a much better pass catcher. McKinnon was top 10 in running back receiving efficiency and usage last year. And because of this, the Kansas City Chiefs re-signed him this offseason. Now, this next concern for Pacheco is major. As you can see right here, Isiah Pacheco ranked 141st in pass protection last year out of just 148 qualifying backs, which means he's not going to get on the field on 3rd down situations. They're not going to risk him blowing up and missing a block and getting Patrick Mahomes injured. And one more thing is that Pacheco was beloved by former offensive coordinator Eric Bieniemy, who's no longer in Kansas City. So now we go to round 7 where there's another tight end who, look, you can just get guys a couple of rounds later who are going to give you similar production. In round 7, Evan Engram of the Jacksonville Jaguars is the worst pick. Now, if we're just looking at last year, yeah, it was great. He had a career high in receptions with 73 and receiving yards with 766. He was the tight end 7 last year, but he really started to come on down the stretch because over the final 6 games of the 2022 season, only George Kittle had more points per game than Evan Engram. Evan Engram outscored Travis Kelce by 32% more points. And because of all this, the fella got paid this offseason. As Spot Track on Twitter points out here, he got a 3-year extension worth about $42 million, $24 million of that guaranteed, a major contract for a tight end. So congrats to him for getting paid, but now he's not in a contract year. And let's dive a little bit deeper into that final 6 games of last year. Because in week 14 last year, Evan Engram had one of the best games of any player all season long. He had 11 receptions, 2 touchdowns, 162 yards, also 15 targets, nearly 40 fantasy points. That means Engram had nearly 25% of his points come from one game. And for a running back, this is fine because they can be consistent after that. For tight ends, it's not as consistent these spike weeks. And now entering this year, the Jaguars swapped out a 33-year-old Marvin Jones who was inefficient with Calvin Ridley as now their wide receiver 1. And Engram didn't have a great target share last year because he was competing with guys like Zay Jones and Christian Kirk. He has to compete with those guys now and Calvin Ridley. The other piece to the puzzle for that tight end in Engram is the fact that there's opportunity cost. You could just wait rounds later and get a guy like Tyler Higbee in round 12 or 13, who honestly, he had more targets last year than Engram and he could put up similar production for 5 rounds later. So basically what I'm saying is in round 7, just go ahead and get another good running back or receiver instead. And then in round 8, make sure you avoid the Eagles running back Rashaad Penny, who honestly, there's some rumors and concerns that he might not even make this roster. Now, it's still likely that he does make the roster, but maybe it's a 20% chance, 30% chance that he doesn't. And look at this. Based on the camp reports, Penny is the hardest one to get a read on. He has the most carries with the 3rd team offense in camp, and he has the 2nd fewest with the 1st team offense. That's not great. And then in the first preseason game, he actually led the Eagles backfield with 9 touches. I mean, look at the other guys seeing a lot of touches in this game. Trey Sermon might not make the team. Kennedy Brooks definitely not going to make the team. It's just an odd thing to give a guy who's missed over 50% of the games in his career a lot of touches in a preseason game that doesn't even matter if your goal is to use him a lot this year. And let's keep in mind that the Eagles don't have a lot invested in Penny. It won't really cost them much, if anything, to actually let him go. He only has right now a $1.3 million contract, but look at this, only $600,000 guaranteed. That's behind Boston Scott on this team. That's behind Kenneth Gainwell on this team. And speaking speaking of Kenneth Gainwell, this is the guy who earned the most touches in the Super Bowl and the playoffs last year, so they trust him. You have DeAndre Swift, who the Eagles just traded a 4th-round pick for, a very efficient back as well. So there's competition here. Not to mention you have Jalen Hurts, who's a top 2, if not number 1 mobile quarterback in the league to steal more work. It's just not worth the hassle here. A lot has to go right for Penny. And of course, let me remind you, Penny struggles to stay healthy, missing 51% of his career games. Plain and simple, when you're in round 8, if Jahan Dotson is there, take him. I'd rather have Antonio Gibson, Khalil Herbert, Gabe Davis, basically most of the players on the screen right now. And I also want to make sure I have this next asset while I'm drafting. It'll have all the tools and analysis you need to do just that. Like our top 255 rankings. You can see right here, Rashaad Penny, we just talked about. He's my 118th player. I am 23 spots behind the market, meaning you definitely shouldn't draft him. Now, to get the blueprint is simple. You just click the link in the description below or scan the QR code on the screen and follow the 2 simple steps. This blueprint is just $5 to help you do everything with your draft, but also help you every single week of the year up to your fantasy playoffs and championship. And if for some reason you don't make the championship, as you can see right here, this is risk-free. I'll just refund that $5. So if you want to join the thousands of people using the blueprint right now, well, scan the QR code or click the link in the description below. Now, in round 9, there's a veteran that I really don't want anything to do with. He's the worst pick in this round, and it is Odell Beckham Jr., who, look, he got paid this offseason. Credit to Odell Beckham Jr. for coming back and getting a really big deal. It's up to $18 million with all the incentives in this. It's like 4 to 5 times more than any other Ravens wide receiver. But also keep in mind that Odell had more leverage here because the Ravens wanted Odell to get Lamar Jackson back in the building during his holdout. So here's what you need to know. Odell Beckham Jr. is now 31 years old, coming off of his 2nd ACL tear. His first one, as you can see here, was in 2020, October 25th, and then his last one was in the Super Bowl, February 13th, which means it's now been over 18 months since he last played football, and the last time we saw him, he wasn't all that great. Because despite playing in the Rams' highly efficient offense in 2021, Odell ranked 77th in wide receiver efficiency and struggled to consistently separate and produce after the catch. And during that season when he was inefficient, he was 29. Now he's 31 years old. And check out this chart by the Fantasy Footballer's website right here. You can see production by age to be a wide receiver 2, a top 24 wide receiver basically. As you start to get older and approach 30, it starts to peak off. And as you approach 32, it's basically irrelevant. Right here at 31, the last 20 years or so, there's only been 17 wide receivers to do it. So less than 1 per year. And now Odell is a potential Hall of Famer, so maybe he could be this guy, but he's not even the number 1 option on his team. Because that option is pretty clearly Mark Andrews, who has the most targets from Lamar in Lamar's career as a starter and the 2nd most tight end targets behind only Kelsey since 2020. And not only that, but he has wide receiver competition in the 1st-round talent in Zay Flowers, who's tearing up apparently training camp and the preseason, and then Rashad Bateman, who finally returned from his foot injury. He was highly efficient, former 1st-round pick before injury last year. And now one more thing about this whole Odell situation. He's already said he's thinking this is going to be his last year, which means there might not be extra motivation to maybe earn another contract with a different team after this season. Now in round 10, there's a wide receiver that I'm just not targeting. He happens to be a rookie. He is a Charger, and it is Quentin Johnston. Now look, at this point in the draft, it's a good idea to target younger players with a lot of upside and good offenses like a Johnston. But compared to the other players who go around him, I just don't like him here. He's the worst pick in round 10. Now the Chargers took him in the 1st round of the draft, and here's what you need to know. You can see right here, if I zoom in a little bit, he is a bigger wide receiver. One of the only big ones in this past draft, like him and a Jonathan Mingo, 6'3", 208 pounds. And when it comes to his traits, he's not the fastest guy. He has above average speed, as you can see here, but it's his burst, it's his quick twitch, and his catch radius. Honestly, he probably does a little bit too much trying to jump for every single ball that he doesn't have to. So those are some of the good things, but the problem was he was never an elite target earner in college. And you can see that right here. In his 3 years of college, look at his target shares. His best was 21%, which is like average, usually like wide receiver 2 numbers, maybe a low-end wide receiver 1. You like to see this number in college being at least 25, closer to 30%, especially for a 1st-round wide receiver. Now, earning targets is something you have to do, and that's not even his biggest issue. Another one of his issues is his drops. Because according to reception perception, Johnston dropped nearly 10% of his catchable targets in college. And sadly, this was on full display in his first preseason game. You can see this right here. That's a really, really difficult catch to make, I agree. And that was actually not credited as a drop, but he did have 3 other drops in that game. But those types of catches you need to be making in an offense with Justin Herbert. And now I see people comparing this to, oh, Jamar Chase couldn't catch passes his first year either. Yeah, but Jamar Chase didn't have that problem in college, and he also was an elite player at getting open in college. Because to make it in the NFL, you have to have consistent hands and get open often, and that's something that Quentin Johnston just wasn't doing, which makes him a pretty risky player, especially when you consider that he's not the number 1 receiver on his offense. He's not the number 2 receiver on his offense. He'll open the year at best as the 3rd wide receiver on his offense with a team that has the target leader out of the backfield last year amongst all running backs in Austin Eckler. And oh yeah, the reports are also that Johnston, the rookie, is still currently towards the end of training camp behind Joshua Palmer in the pecking order. So I'm not a fan of this rookie wide receiver in round 10 or this next receiver in round 11. And that's the Lions wide receiver Jameson, Jameson Williams, who has fallen a little bit, right? He was getting taken in the 9th and 10th rounds at times, but the 11th round is still far too high. Because Jameson Williams, you all know, he's suspended the first 6 games of the year. If you didn't know, now you know. And he's still being taken ahead of guys like Rashaad Bateman, Sky Moore, potential wide receiver 1s for their team. Now, in his first year as a rookie, he missed his first 11 games because of an ACL rehab. He only played in 6 games, was limited when he came back to like 10 to 20% of the snaps, leading to just 1 catch and 9 targets last year. And there's a poor track record of rookie receivers who missed that much time as rookies actually producing after that, and now he's going to miss 6 games this year. And all of the camp news is not good on Jameson Williams. Look at this. His own head coach, Dan Campbell, said that Jameson Williams has to work on his hands. He's just got to grind on it. It'll never probably be like the elite pass catchers that you've seen, but it'll be just fine. So his own head coach, who has been frustrated with Williams got in a fight in camp as well, is literally saying he'll never have elite wide receiver hands. And it's worth mentioning that there's really no way Jameson Williams can hurt you this year if you don't draft him. 1, he's suspended 6 games, and 2, there's 0 chance he'll be his team's wide receiver 1 because of Amon-Ra St. Brown. All right, now we go to round 12, and there's a guy on this screen who just stands out completely. I mean, outside of the kickers and defenses, we're not spending a pick on them, and if you have to, do it with your last picks of the draft, but it's going to be the veteran Foreman of the Bears. Because as of right now, it looks like the veteran might even be a cut candidate, but definitely is the RB3 on this team. Because Khalil Herbert is the standout running back 1. He's the most efficient back in this backfield in terms of NFL success, and you can see here in the first preseason game with the starting unit, he played 100% of the snaps with the starters at the RB position. And then there's the new rookie 4th round pick Johnston, who's been standing out in camp. He's the best pass blocker in camp. He's been the best pass catcher in camp as well amongst the running backs, and he had a nice preseason debut. But despite this, Roschon goes 2 rounds after Foreman. That's a guy you should target around 14. Now, here's what you need to know about Foreman. He was signed this offseason to a $3 million deal, as Adam Schefter tweets here, but only $1 million of this was guaranteed. So there's a potential chance he doesn't make the roster, but definitely doesn't have enough investment to have to see work. And it's not like he was great last year. He was just 43rd in yards per touch, and 32nd in rushing was below average. But fantasy drafters might remember Foreman's name last year because he had a couple of weeks stretch that was good, but for the most part, it was bad. In week 7, he scored 16.5 points, but then in week 8, he had 32 points and 3 touchdowns. Now, that's probably what a lot of you remember because at some point, he was a decent waiver wire target. But based on his current situation, I want nothing to do with him. I mean, these are guys who go 2 rounds later than him. Jalen Warren, Jacoby Myers, Roschon Johnson, Tyler Boyd. I'd just rather have all these guys multiple rounds later. And I'd also rather have all those guys who go in like round 14 over this next guy. And that would be our worst pick in round 13, Jalin Hyatt, the rookie receiver for the Giants. This fella has had an up and down training camp, but a lot of you might think it's been a great training camp because all you see is the highlights. Look, the Giants are a part of the New York media that gets a lot of coverage, and they love to put out clips because, look, why not? Why not put out the incentivizing clips for your rookie wide receiver? As you can see right here, it's just a pretty simple deep ball in practice. Yeah, when you're practicing that so many times, eventually you're going to have Jalin Hyatt catch one. But as of right now, Jalin Hyatt is not a starter. And per the reports, he has a long way to go. As you can see, based on the preseason, you had Paris Campbell and Darius Slayton rested as starters, and Isaiah Hodgins was then the main starter on the outside. And apparently Sterling Shepard looks good returning from yet another injury, and he is a dominant slot player, which would push Jalin Hyatt down the depth chart. And Jalin Hyatt has some real issues. First off, we could talk about his size at just 6 foot, but more importantly, 176 pounds. Now, I think if you don't weigh a lot, that's fine. Like Devonta Smith had success, but Devonta Smith was the Heisman player, and he dominated on the outside in college, something Jalin Hyatt never did. Because Hyatt lacks major experience as an outside receiver. He played 88% of his college snaps out of the slot and mostly ran vertical routes, which does not work in the NFL. So because of that, I just rather have guys that go after him. Nico Collins might be his team's wide receiver 1, and he somehow goes after Jalin Hyatt. I mean, I even take some running back depth in Chuba Hubbard and Kareem Hunt, as you can see here. Now, these are the guys that you want to make sure you avoid, and you have to avoid them on a platform like Underdog. Now, Underdog is a best ball platform. More on what that is in a second. Look at these contests they have. $15 million in prizes, $3 million to first, their best ball contest. They have a puppy that's $5 entry, $1 million in prizes. And now best ball is great because you just draft your team and then you don't do anything else. No waivers. They just take your highest scoring players and you compete for millions of dollars. Now, this is their flagship tournament, the one that I'm playing in a lot. It's $3 million to first, as you can see right here, Best Ball Mania 4. And for a limited time right now, if you scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below, you'll get a free deposit match up to $100. So if you put in 100, you'll get 100 back. You put in 25, you get 25 back up to 100. So make sure you circle these players when you're doing your best ball draft so you don't draft them. They're your worst players. Now, if you want to see the players that are skyrocketing up my rankings and you should draft them, well, check out this beautiful video right over here. And make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all the latest information to beat your buddies this year.